First of all, can you hear me at all? Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes,
Was that?
yes, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Man, my mic wasn't working before. Cool. Oh shit. I'm sorry. So tell me more about your position. I'm curious. I haven't really delved into this subject much. This is going to be my first QallOut debate. So I'm just kind of, curious about what your position is and, how
So,
that relates to what I believe.
so my position is that income inequality causes a net negative interaction into our lives.
Okay.
Basically, that if there's inequality within the system, then there is a more worse outcome versus an equal distribution of wealth or income.
Okay. And so how do we measure that precisely, the outcomes, for example?
The outcomes, so that's what that's what my three contention case is based on. If you want me to, I can just go through my case and then you can figure out where you want to attack in the case.
Yeah, okay, just real quickly, the reason I chose this topic was kind of randomly. I was scrolling through all the topics and I just happened to mostly agree with everyone. And this one, I just saw the caption on your video and it said, "I am a Christian conservative." So I immediately said debate now. So I'm just kind of curious more about you. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, first off, there's something to be said here. So I am a Christian conservative. I do enjoy apologetics from time to time. I'm a trained economist and training to be a better economist at the time. And I typically do not prefer to debate what I believe in. I'll take whatever subject there is, whether I agree with it or not, because I find debating and argumentation a completely different part of the world than actually trying to prove something right or prove something wrong. So to me, debate's a sport and a fun one at that. So I don't
Yeah.
necessarily have to believe in what I say.
Okay. Just a background about me. I know a little bit about Christianity. I started. I was at Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary for my master's. Dropped out after a year due to sequestration. I was going to be an Army chaplain, but it kind of devolved into a situation where I was basically trolling a lot of the professors who were young Earth creationists and literalists, and so yeah, I thought it was best for me to just leave. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you've seen some of my other debates, I am a Christian, but I'm not a young Earth creationist. I am a theological evolutionist, uh,
Hmm.
theist, theistic evolutionist. So I agree
Okay.
with evolution, and I just think it's just a different mechanism used by God, and I don't see anywhere in Scripture that it would debunk that or state that that's wrong. Specifically with Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then later, I think a lot of that's just meant to give a timeline of Judaism more so than it is a timeline for the Earth. I think that
Okay. Okay.
extrapolation is wrong. Okay, so let me get into my case. So, in a modern economy where we have seen the richest people continue to accumulate more and more wealth, with this conjecture, this House affirms that income equality is a major issue in economics. To further clarify, I offer some definitions. Income inequality refers to the extent to which income is distributed in an uneven manner among a population. Economic mobility is the ability of an individual, family, or some other group to improve or lower their economic status, usually measured in income. Now, before moving on, let me clarify the burdens of this realm. As the affirmative, I must only prove that the income, wealth inequality in our present system is an economic problem. The debate is not about the practicality of redistribution methods. Having said that, my value is a more equitable world. Contention
Okay.
one: income inequality increases crime. It is demonstrably true that poverty increases crime. If income inequality leads to more overall poverty, then it is logical to assume that income inequality causes more crime. To further articulate this point, I'll give you an excerpt from Race, Economic Inequality, and Violent Crime. In agreement with the relative deprivation thesis, but the overall violent crime rate and the black on black crime rate was predicted by the measure of economic inequality, income inequality. That's from Stoltenberg on that paper. With fewer methods of obtaining resources in our society, the number of poor increasing, the risk of punishment does not outweigh the gain of assets with respect.
Is this affecting the audio? Is
You
it
want me to
windy
read
to
on?
you? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Sorry.
As the
Oh,
poor
go ahead.
struggle to meet the constant battery of regulations, the rich are busy buying Congress to enact more and more regulations to throttle the spirit of the poor. This type of consistent mistreatment will indubitably cause resentment and anger within the poor, leading to violent protests. With certainty, I can say income inequality damages society. Contention 2. The wealthy maintain a disproportionate political power. I alluded to this fact in my first contention that inequality leads to more inequality. The rich will amass enough resources to bribe any high-ranking official, whether it is to save face from a crime or to limit entrance into the marketplace. To further illustrate this point, I want to point out the piece of the abstract from a paper called A Comparative Study of Inequality and Corruption from Yul Jong-sung. The wealthy have both greater motivation and more opportunity to engage in corruption, where poor areas are more vulnerable to extortion and less able to monitor and hold the rich and powerful accountable as inequality decreases. Inequality also adversely affects social norms about corruption and people's belief about the legitimacy of rules and institutions, thereby making it easier for them to tolerate corruption as acceptable behavior.
That seems about right.
Yep. The wealthy use power and money to influence our political spectrum. They bribe officials, they force wage control, and they force out other players for government contracts. The market has a mechanism built in that stops things from happening, but the issue arises when someone legislates against the market mechanism. When the rich push for more regulation, they are choking the marketplace of ideas and entrepreneurs. They corrupt the system so they themselves can benefit. It becomes circular, and after such a time, leading to its logical conclusion that the wealthiest become ever more wealthy, all while shutting down the modes to create wealth. The market cannot withstand such interferences. It will either implode or lead to a violent revolution against the system itself. Contention 3, income inequality decreases education. The research suggests that nations with a higher degree of income inequality and relative small and low income population have substantially higher education levels. To give a brief overview of this argument, we'll take a look at the article in The World Development by Cornell University, author Eric Thorbecke. The main reason for underinvestment in education is that credit markets are imperfect. The poor, possessing little to no collateral in the setting of a developing country, are practically sealed off from formal credit market. These stylized conditions lead to a vicious cycle where initial inequality and poverty result in underinvestment in education among the poor, which further exacerbate inequality in the long term. This once again shows the negative side effects of inequality, where the rich are maintaining the important channels for economic mobility. The more unequal the society, the greater the decline in public education programs. This is due to the rich not wanting to pay for public goods. There is also the malinvestment problems with the system due to rich choosing to misallocate the money for corruption purposes. This consistent misallocation of public and private funds with regards to education will have more adverse effects on our society, creating a dichotomy of the rich and poor. We can look at the growing bubble in the USA of student debt, where the poor are forced to pay back large sums of money to get the opportunity to continue education.
Okay. Is that that's your argument?
Those are my 3 arguments.
Okay. I guess the 2 main points I would bring up is I'm a consequentialist, so for me, the outcome matters more than the intent in general. My main question would be, what is a population? Like, how far does a population extend to? For example, there's massive wealth inequality between you, for example, and someone living in Bangladesh. You're an order of magnitude richer than they are. Does that create negative consequences for them, or like how far does the population extend? I'm not sure.
So I will go and talk about what Jordan Peterson says, and he says it's not income inequality necessarily that creates crime, it's relative inequality. So if we look at places where there are very rich people that all live in a mass, you will rarely find crime. If you look at a place where there's all poor people living beside each other, you will rarely find crime. Where you find the highest amounts of crime is where there is a relative income distribution that's not set. So you have men fighting for the dominance hierarchy, And to meet those ends, they will do illegal deeds. And that's what causes crime. It's that relative income inequality between one to the next. For instance, let's say you grow up in Chicago, right? Chicago is a very poor place, but it's split down there. A lot of people make the conversation about what's called the train tracks, right? The poor people live on the other side of the train tracks. And when they see across the train tracks the rich people on the other side, they realize that there's a distribution error within their own world, and that there's a dominance hierarchy that they are not achieving. Therefore, they use means of illegal activities to meet that head. So they're going to create their own dominance hierarchy.
Okay, so if everyone were equally poor, there wouldn't be crime, or less crime.
There would be less.
There would be less crime. So in very, very poor countries such as Bangladesh, or I don't know, some African countries, we should expect to find very, very little to no crime, or.
Well, so one, we have to take in like cultural factors, right? So we can't just remove the cultural factors. So one, there may be cultural factors that what they consider a crime might not be what we consider a crime. Second,
so like stealing,
right? And then the incentives built into that system may be a bit different. Here in the United States, we run from a mostly capitalistic, incentive-based culture, right? Whereas in third world countries, they typically don't have that. Secondly, I've made this statement.
Are there not markets in third world countries like Somalia? Let's take Somalia for example. Are there markets in Somalia?
Well, there are markets, but what America has built as a market system is so much broader and so much bigger that it's not necessarily the same thing, right? So sure, you have markets, you have money. I talked about credit markets, and then there's like repo markets within credit markets, and then there's other style of markets where we have the stock market, for instance. There's so many more markets built into it that there's so many more levels.
That humans exist, right? If there's a supply of something and there's some kind of demand for something, let's say a cell phone, it leads to a situation where you can actually have everyone in Somalia has a cell phone and good reception, even though there's no central government. The
Sure.
market still exists independent of any government. As long as there's humans, there will be, in fact, be markets.
Right, but we're talking about we're talking about the complexity of a market here. So yeah, there's markets, but the structure of the market is much different, especially if you go to like Ghana and I guess you could say Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They don't have the same markets. Zimbabwe doesn't have the same level.
So it's not absolutely true that wealth inequality necessarily causes negative consequences, but it can. Is that what you're saying? Or it's absolutely true in every case?
I'm saying it's absolutely true in every case. Specifically, okay, so we talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know how much you know about the battle there. So one of the reasons why we had the Rwanda crisis and things of that nature is because when the Danes left, the Dutch. When the Dutch left, they had built a system between the Tutsi and
the Tutsi and I'm not Interhamwe. Is the Interhamwe? No.
Yeah, well, you know what I'm talking about. The Tutsi and the other side.
That's the limit of my knowledge of that subject.
Right.
But.
Right. So the Tutsi looked a little bit more European.
That's what it was. Hutu power. I remember that.
Yeah, the Hutus, the Hutus and the Tutsi, right? So the Tutsi were the main ones. Even though they were a minority, they had most of the power because the Dutch respected them and liked them more because they looked more European. And so there was this big inequality between the two when the Dutch left. So what did the Hutu do? Well, the Hutu had the numbers on their side, so they went and slaughtered the Tutsi.
Okay.
And I could have that backwards, but what I'm saying is that inequality that was there drove that to happen. So we can look at third world instances of it being true. It's just
So,
less
but
likely.
for your argument to hold, crime would have had to basically end once they were pushed out of power, and there shouldn't have been any crime within the Hutu community since they were all equally poor, right?
I don't think they were all equally poor
They
because
shouldn't have robbing and stealing from each other if it's true that, you know, equality or inequality is the cause of crime. Um, I mean, it
so
seems like if my wife is cheating on me, I don't put I'm living in an African nation. I don't put a whole lot of thought into the fact that there's richer people elsewhere. I'm probably, based on culture or something, I'm probably still just going to kill my wife in either case.
possibly, but why would your wife have left you? Typically because
No,
there's
I'm saying if we're raised in that environment, like here in America, of course, that's not like a valid response to that,
no, I'm
transgression or whatever.
I'm talking about even in that culture, right? So why would your wife have cheated on you? Obviously, there's a male within a higher level of the dominance hierarchy, whether it be one of the three fundamentals, whether it's health, with
Maybe he just had a better. What if he just had a bigger dick than me? I mean,
well, that
what
puts
if
him
it was?
higher. That puts him higher on the dominance hierarchy.
Oh, so now penis size is part of inequality?
Would you, based on your argument right there, it would be.
Okay. Well, in that case, inequality. I guess it's really a tautology in that case because inequality simply exists. Will always exist. We have no real mechanism by which we can make everyone have an equal penis length or, I mean, if we're talking about like physical attributes in terms of inequality, it seems like what you're arguing is necessarily a tautology. But actually, now I'm looking at the topic. The topics is income inequality. So,
Well, that's because I'm addressing some of your secondary argumentations on third world countries and things of that nature. Because of course it's going to be hard to state that it's income inequality. If nobody has income, there's still going to be inequality, and we can lead the same arguments away from the income distribution methods and how that affects and go to other unequal and unequal circumstances that will create it.
Be inequality in the sense that there's only one me, so the supply is one, right? The demand, if there's ever a demand that is higher than one, it's necessarily going to lead to inequality. Or for example, let's say I have a chicken and someone else is hungry and they don't have a chicken. That's inequality, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so even at the micro level, your argument is essentially that inequality is the driver of all crime, or
not
some
all crime. I can't. No, I would say the majority of crime, and the reason why I can't say all crime is because we all have to agree that there are some folks out there that are just evil.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was going to be the next thing I brought up. Like, what about just people who are fucking crazy? But
Right.
okay, so you believe it's the majority of crime is created by inequality, and inequality is really being defined here at the micro level, like simply having a chicken or a T-shirt that someone else does not possess is necessary.
Yeah, and I find that to be pretty prima facie because imagine you are starving and you see someone with a chicken and you feel that this person doesn't deserve a chicken, but you do. A much higher level of going over there and steal that chicken. But if both of you have a chicken, you're much less likely to go steal their chicken.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, in that case, it's a tautology, and I can't really argue against that. So in that case, we have to go to consequences. Let's imagine there are no chickens, and everyone's starving. Would you consider that to be a better outcome, or?
Well, when I frame this debate in saying that my value here was a more equitable world. Now, when we get down to consequentialism,
But that's equitable, right? If everyone's starving, it's still equal.
Right. So what I'm saying is that I don't necessarily have to frame my argument within your consequentialist frame, because yes, I can say that it's a more equitable world, and that's more of what we want, more of what we want. But I also stated that I don't want to talk about the redistribution methods or distribution methods, because
No, we don't. We
like
don't
you
have to
said,
talk
it's
about
so
that
hard.
because we can just say, okay, everyone's equally starving. There's no chickens. How? And you've said yourself that it necessarily leads to negative consequences if anyone here has a chicken. So if nobody has a chicken, doesn't that imply that this is somehow a better outcome or consequence?
It would say it's a better outcome within the frame of my reference, yes. From a
Well,
consequentialist
then
standpoint,
I would have to fundamentally disagree. I don't think mass starvation is a better outcome than inequality. You know, I'd rather some people not starve to death if I have to choose between some or all.
so how would you delineate that? How would you pick who gets to eat and who doesn't?
Markets basically take care of that issue. You know, whoever wants it the most and whoever's willing to produce the highest commitment strategy in order to obtain that thing.
Well, markets are
Generally,
imperfect.
they're very imperfect, but we don't have a better mechanism with which to handle these kinds of issues. How do we determine, who gets a hamburger and who gets a cucumber? Markets. Our entire food system is market based. The government doesn't grow any food at all, and that's why we have so much food.
Well, that and we subsidize farmers and things of that nature
True, but
beyond.
I mean, they probably don't need those. I mean, for them, it's more like extra money in their pockets for the most part, especially when you consider most of it's going to corn ethanol, another idiotic government program.
Right. So back to the point. So we're talking about like a more equitable world in here, and so I'm going to ask a few questions of you. So
Sure.
based on my three contentions, not necessarily the later parts about third world and the different levels of inequality. When we look at the first world problems and we see the inequality and we see the issues that it causes, how do you deal with it?
Well, I kind of think are we confining inequality just to the first world? Because I'm way richer than practically 99% of everyone living in Bangladesh. I mean, how should I feel about that? I don't know.
I mean, why would you even? Here's my thing, and I've always kind of disliked that argument and this is even coming from someone who's used that argument on many times. I really don't like that argument specifically because it doesn't have the same consequential issues that we are talking about here. When we are talking about income inequality within the United States or some other rich Western world, we're talking specifically about the consequences that deals with that world. How do you deal with those consequences within that set? Sure, there's
Okay, so there is actually a geographic proximity element to your theory about income inequality, right? It's not absolute. It doesn't extend to the world, right? It's confined to some certain specific area, or no?
No, but specifically talking about income inequality, it does. When I talk about other types of inequality, like we were talking about earlier, dominance hierarchy inequality, relative inequality within a village or hunter-gatherer system, you're going to have issues. But I'm specifically talking about income inequality, which does
But I mean,
limit it.
they have smartphones, they have televisions, they see these extremely wealthy people living lives they could never possibly aspire to. Is that creating some kind of crime over there in Bangladesh, or does it not reach that far? I'm just trying to understand your argument better. What are the limitations to your theory? Are there any, or is it an absolute?
I think I've answered this, but I say it's an absolute within the relative community to that, right?
So how far does the relative community extend is my question, I guess, and why?
So I would probably state relative the relative size of the community would be here in the
So, like,
United
I live in
States.
Hawaii, and so someone in DC is rich, for example. Does that cause me pain and suffering, or
Where do you
how, like,
live?
how far, or does it go to California? Like, how far does it extend? Like,
So
how far should?
within the United States, it's probably city based. Most research has been done city based, and then ethnic
So
regions have
within
been
a city, okay, got it.
right.
I'm got a better understanding now.
Right, but that also applies to when we talk about geographical, like America to Mexico. We could say that level of inequality could have negative side effects. When we say Europe compared to Africa and the Middle East, that could have negative side effects. When we say China to North Korea to South Korea to Japan, that could have negative side effects. So it
Okay,
really
and are
depends
they,
on
but are
what
they
you're
net
looking at.
negative? Like, have we added up all the benefits to inequality?
You've given me none to go off of. I don't know what the
Okay,
benefits
well,
of
let's
inequality.
take a case example. We'll start with China because it's, the most obvious. So once upon a time, under communist rule, everyone was equally poor, more or less, very low inequality, extremely low, in fact. Um, Now, would you argue that that was a better outcome than current China, and why or why not?
So, no, I would not say it's a better out. Or hold on, the Communist Party, I think, had a better outcome than the current party as it stands. Specifically, from the idea that when Mao did the Great Leap Forward, he killed 60 million people. Of those 60 million people, that was probably the lowest 10% of his population, based on IQ and other factors. So, when you take out that bottom 10% of the lowest production and the lowest producing individuals, you're obviously going to have some gain forward. Now,
Okay.
when they opened the markets and made the world and made their markets open, it's still communist driven. They still are within very communist driven hierarchy. So it's not like there's an equality there. There's a giant inequality, and this inequality is no different than the one that they had in communism. Talk
Hmm.
about the Kremlin and Mao's China, we see great levels of income inequality, higher levels of income inequality than we've seen in capitalist lands at the same time. That's
Right. Oh,
because
so
you had
can we? Is there any way we could back up for a second? So you're saying that eliminating 10% of the population leads to good outcomes?
yes, it could.
Okay. What metric are we using to determine that exactly?
Um, IQ and production.
So IQ and production went up because we. Oh, are you still here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so IQ and production went up due to killing 10% of the population?
It could, yes. It very
Is
well could.
that's the reason it went up, not due to market reforms, or
Specifically,
because I mean, you're an economist, right? I think there's a consensus on this issue in the field of economics that it was actually market reforms that made China rich. I mean, I thought that was a consensus at this point. I didn't know anyone really disputed that.
people dispute things all the time. There's people that say the concentration camps of Germany in World War II never existed. You're always going to
Oh.
find somebody who's going to say no, that's not true.
But do
People aren't
you
going to believe
dispute that?
gravity.
Do you disagree with the consensus that market reforms made China what it is today?
I disagree with that.
So part of your theory is that eliminating 10% of the population is what actually led to China's growth, but it also happened to coincide with market reforms. Is that your position?
Yes, but again, we're talking specifically about income inequality, and I've stated that China is not the best example because China's inequality is still just as high now as it was during the communist age.
Why do you, why do you believe that? I mean, it's
Communism
not true.
has a higher. communism has a higher level of Gini coefficient. You have a very, very top class and you have a very, very low class. We have never found in the world an actual socialist or communist government that has ever had true equality. That's one of the main arguments that Milton Friedman had against it, is that even if you went for equality, you would not find it, which is why he labeled liberty above equality. Because
okay, so it's an unattainable goal, but somehow income inequality is net negative. But then I would point to the consequences of China's market reforms. We've lifted 1 billion people out of poverty since then, most of it coming from China. 1 billion people were living in poverty prior to these economic market reforms. Is that not a better consequence? Like not having people living in abject poverty? I mean, yeah, relative poverty sucks. I mean, there are some papers and some science that shows that this can, lead to negative consequences. But can we not agree that abject poverty is objectively worse than relative poverty?
Yeah, but that's not what this debate is about. So sure.
No, it's talking about outcomes and consequences. So China did the market reforms, got rich in the process, lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. Is that not a better outcome? Yeah, there's more inequality now. There's, Chinese bill. I've been to China. I've been to Hong Kong. There's more billionaires and stuff right now, but even the poor are better off than they were, even though now they're like way more unequal than they ever were under communism. The richest person in the Communist Party cannot even hold a candle to the richest person in China now.
Well, the richest person of China now is the leader of the Communist Party of China now. So there's no difference.
Right, but even if we compare that leader to a previous leader in terms of strictly wealth, I mean, they're not even really comparable. So wealth inequality has in fact increased, and China's better off because of it. Or I guess I would say in spite of that.
I disagree. I think the system is working out just fine, specifically with respect
communism. I'm sorry. Which system?
To communism. So
Maoism was working out just fine.
With respect to lower levels of crime rates, lower death rates. With respect to.
But didn't he kill 65 million people though?
Yeah, but that was for the Great Leap Forward. That wasn't necessarily a part of his governmental system. So the Great Leap Forward, a lot of people seem to think that it had something to do with like Mao was just killing off his normal Chinese people. He was killing off people that didn't want to be part of the Chinese Revolution, that were very bad at what they did, and it wasn't.
Or had some kind of university education, or were perceived as being too elite or too wealthy due to education. There's a lot of. 65 million people is necessarily going to include a very large number of people with incredible diversity within that group.
Right. But again, so let's try to jump back on topic to income inequality. Because as of right now...
so I've given China as a perfect example of how increasing income inequality has inadvertently led to better consequences and better outcomes for the poor.
Right, but here's the thing: you haven't proven that income inequality has changed in China. I don't.
So you believe it's exactly the same as it was under Mao in terms of the gap between rich and poor?
Relatively the same, yes. They still
so
don't have a standard.
Let's compare the bottom 10% of China to the top 1% of China, or 10%, or whatever. That's not changed at all since when? Since the 60s?
I would say no, specifically to the power structure in China.
Okay, has wealth inequality in America increased since that time, and how do we know that? How do we measure that?
Yes,
because we still have a president, we still have Congress.
We've had a high level of Gini coefficient increase in the past 30 years.
And that's measured in dollars, right? Or, I mean, what metric are we using to determine what wealth
Gini
inequality is? Because, so the Gini coefficient has not changed from Maoist times until today in China. That's your position?
No, my position is that the China isn't the same as the Gini coefficient in the United States, right? So what I'm saying is that the power structure of China has not changed, right? It's still
okay, but neither has it in America. So,
well, it has.
How do we determine that it's increased? Because I mean, it's the same thing here. We still have a president. We still have Congress. Same, same power structure. The only thing that's actually changed is wealth, which is substantially increased.
Right. No.
So that's how we know there's greater inequality, right? And so why wouldn't that equally apply to China?
Because China had a system set up beforehand that specifically helped power stay concentrated. In the United States, we did not have a system set up to concentrate power in either the state nor the public or the private. But what we have found is that as income inequality has grown, we have seen an increase in public, private, and governmental structuring change favoring the wealthy. Now, in China, they had already had a system that favored the wealthy. They had already had a system that favored the Communist Party. There hasn't been a grand change to that power structure here in the United States. We've seen a great change to that power structure. For instance, we've seen now we have the highest level of taxes that we've seen, paid taxes, not highest taxes level, highest level of paid taxes. We've seen more regulation now than any time in our country, which reduces people from entering into the market. All of this is specifically caused by income inequality, and that was part of my second contention. China did not have that power structure, or did not have the same power structure as America before that. America's moved far more to a centralized government. China has basically stayed the same. If a company in China goes belly up, the government buys it and the government owns it. Most of these companies that are owned in China are owned by the government themselves. There is no major change. The only thing that's happened in China is that they've gotten wealthier as a whole, but that pie has not changed. It's not the zero-sum pie fallacy that Thomas Sowell would talk about, because the power structure there doesn't allow for that pie to get any bigger for the poor.
But it did get bigger. It for sure got. I mean, China has a bigger economy than we do now, and that was not the case. They were like 20 below us back then.
They do not have it. They have half.
It depends on how you measure it. I mean, it's always like this. So USA, then China, then USA, then China. It fluctuates, but
no.
Okay, at least they're approximately close to America. Could you agree to that in terms of economic output?
No,
they're way closer than they were under Mao. Can we agree on that?
Sure, but we're way farther away than what we should be if we would have had more free market reforms.
Okay, so wealth inequality and wealth in general has in fact increased in China.
No, it's still the same power structure. There's wealth, but it's not. It's different specifically because of the power structure within China. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's not the same. As wealth increases in the United States, it concentrates itself. When wealth increases in China, it stays concentrated. It's not like it's a higher level dispersal effect. Now, you talked about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not China. Not okay. At all. Hong Kong is the capitalist paradigm of the world, and it grew very fast, too fast.
Yeah,
actually.
Exactly. I mean, Hong Kong makes the case for markets, and so does China, but
not China, because the power structure hasn't changed. China has done specifically enough to make sure that their abject poverty rate goes down, but that does not change the inequality within the governmental system. That power structure is still.
It seems like you're making these arbitrary distinctions. I mean, let's go back to the topic. Income inequality is net negative. Income. No, so now we're talking dollar amounts, right? That for sure has increased in China. You can't even dispute that. That's just a fact. And it didn't lead to a net negative consequence. So, I mean, doesn't that basically refute your central claim?
No, it doesn't, because again, you're looking at apples versus oranges. So you can look at cases, again, I go back to Africa, where we can have wealth increase, but that doesn't change
Inequality, income inequality increased, and it didn't lead to net negative. Like this is a very counter example, like a factual dispute here, because we have your central claim, income inequality is net negative. We have a real life, real world example of income inequality increasing and not leading to net negative consequences.
So
there's at least some kind of limitation to your argument, right? Maybe it's not absolute. Maybe, it's true in this scenario, but maybe not. Sometimes it leads to good consequences. Sometimes it doesn't, right?
No, I fundamentally disagree with that. One, because again, we have to compare apples to oranges. Two, we have to talk about the proper metrics to look at apples versus oranges.
Well, how do we measure income? What other way do we measure income?
What are you talking about? I gave you the Gini coefficient for the United States, and most of the world.
Okay, so that's increased in China.
Yes, it has increased in China. And
it's led to net positive, lifted 1 billion people out of poverty.
Well, I wouldn't say
so. That's a direct counterexample.
Well, here's the thing. You haven't shown how income inequality has made that change. All you've stated is that they had market reform, income inequality happened, at the same time, life got better. So you have to link that argument to something. You can't just say that.
See, that would be arguing the inverse. I'm not arguing the inverse. I'm just saying that there are limitations to your central claim, which is that income inequality is net negative. We have an example of that not being true, a real world, real life example where income inequality did not lead to net negative consequences. It in fact led to good consequences in that 1 billion people were lifted out of abject poverty.
But that's not saying that income inequality did that. That's the distinction I'm making here. There's no link between income inequality and those good consequences that you could talk about. You cannot prove, and you have not proven, that that income inequality rise was directly proportional with the rise of coming out of abject poverty, and that they've come in with a rise and made life better for the Chinese. You have not proven that. You have also not disproven the idea that there is a difference between the two comparison. So we have China and we have America. We have most European countries which favor the free market. And then we have a country that does not favor the free market and has not changed the power structure. So when we talk about income inequality, sure, that doesn't necessarily apply there, but there's still the inequality based on how wealth is distributed in China that still causes this massive rift between one to the other that causes negative problems within the system itself.
But I'm not arguing the inverse. I'm disputing your central claim, which is that income inequality is net negative. I've given you a real world example that contradicts that claim. It's a real world example. We have an example of income inequality increasing, and it did not lead to negative consequences. I mean, that's still where we have to come back to that. There is a flaw in your argument because it contradicts the real world evidence that we do have.
No, because you have not explained how income inequality has created this lowering of poverty levels.
But I don't have to. That's your argument. I'm disputing your argument.
You can't just say because something happens, therefore my argument's useless. You have to explain why that argument doesn't work. Okay?
Well, no, I just did, because there's an example of it not being true. A real world, like if, all swan, there are no black swans. Okay, I found a black swan.
But you have not explained how that black swan works.
But I don't have to. Your claim is that income inequality is net negative. I've just given you a counterexample.
And that's not.
I don't have to prove that it's net positive. I just have to disprove your argument. At least show the limitations to it.
You have to prove something to make the claim. I get that the burden of proof is on me. I understand that. What you're missing is that you have to explain how your side works. You have not done that. You just said, here's a case. This is true. There's this link between your warrant and claim that needs evidence to be true. That's the problem. I don't understand what the difference is between there, because I've given you.
Hey, a lot like Glock, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to debate me. This was fun for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good one.